The Tapping Boy by Head of Spectre. When the sun is high and springtime wanes, the tapping boy dances upon the blades. Be silent, give tribute, and offer up praise, or he will tear down what you have raised. I still hear that chant in my dreams. I still feel the pain it left behind, and I dread the pain that is still to come. I know that I will never be free. I know my family will never be free. But I hope we can at least appease him when he comes for us again. The sign we passed on the interstate on the way to Sycamore Springs read, "You'll always be a part of the community." It seemed like a kindly little welcome to a small town that looked to be the ideal place for my family to grow. Sycamore Springs was a nice little town in a peaceful part of Louisiana. The neighborhood was old, filled with beautiful colonial-style houses, and it had plenty of charms. When Scott and I had started talking about having another child, we'd agreed that we needed both a bigger home and a better neighborhood. We'd both grown up in a small town down in Texas with small town values, and I don't mean that as a compliment. On one of our date nights, we'd hired a babysitter to look after Elsie for the evening, a lovely young girl in her mid-20s. She'd come to our house wearing a pistol on her hip, and when we'd questioned it, she insisted it was just for her own safety. Long story short, we figured we'd rather just eat some microwaved macaroni and cheese and watch Frozen again, rather than leave our 3-year-old daughter in the care of a stranger with a gun. Our new home was hardly the nicest on the block, but it was still gorgeous compared to what we left behind. Cheaper too, if you can believe that. It was a 2-story house with white brick. It showed its age, but not as much as it could have. Given the money we'd spent on it, a little bit of age on a century-old house wasn't an issue for us. Scott and I knew that with a little bit of TLC, we could make it look just like new. We settled in quickly enough. Our neighbors seemed to be genuinely good folks. On one side, we had an older gentleman by the name of Eric Compton. He was a kindly sort, with soft brown eyes and a white goatee, who'd come to check in on us and introduce himself the day we'd moved in, and he'd been so good with Elsie. "We don't see a lot of new arrivals," he'd said when we invited him in for a drink. We only had soda, but we didn't want to be rude. "So it's always nice to see a new face." "Really, I would have thought this neighborhood would be in a lot higher demand," Scott had said. Eric's smile had faded just a little bit. "Lot of history here," he'd said. "Not all of it good. Besides, we're a little out of the way out here. Some people don't want to deal with the drive." "Well, it hardly bothers me," I'd said. "I usually work from home, and Scott just got himself a new job in town." "Is that so?" Eric had asked. "Well then, would you mind if I'd asked what your trade was?" "Landscaping. I'll be working for 4 Seasons starting next week." "4 Seasons, huh? They're the guys working on the garden downtown," Eric had said. "They did some masterful work. You really ought to go through it. I'm sure your little one would just love it. Come summer, the colors are so beautiful. It really is a sight to see. I'm sure it'll be even better in a few months once you folks are finished with it." "Well, I'll make sure you're not disappointed," Scott had said. We'd talked well into the afternoon before Eric had left, but it was as warm a reception to the neighborhood as we could have hoped for. Eric was the one who organized our housewarming party a few days later, and from there we settled in nicely. Scott started his new job, and my office had been one of the first things I'd set up when we moved in. Elsie started preschool, so I wouldn't have to keep an eye on her at all hours of the day, and gradually we found a new normal. Sycamore Springs seemed to be just as perfect a home as was advertised. I was happy, as was Scott and Elsie. We'd found our home. Discussions about another baby resumed. We started planning and trying, and there was a thrill to that. I'd loved Scott for most of my life, and being able to playfully flirt with him after we tucked Elsie into bed made me feel like a teenager again. That said, when Scott and I christened the new house, it was a lot better than the blind fumbling that had ensued in the back of his car after prom. But the same thrill of new love was still there. My husband still got my heart racing with a cocktail of emotions, just like he always had. I can safely say that I'd never been happier than I was when we moved to Sycamore Springs. I should have known it was too good to be true. It was late May when I noticed the empty shelves at the grocery store. I'd stopped by on a Saturday to do our shopping and was more than a little shocked to see aisles of mostly bare shelves. The meat had been hit the hardest. Just about everything was gone, whether it was fresh or frozen. I remember I had walked through the aisles, picking up what scraps I could find, and watching as people checked out with carts full of what sparse things they could buy. Clearly, I'd missed some kind of rush. I'd turned into one of the aisles and saw a stock boy trying to stock a shelf. I say trying since there were people taking food right out of the boxes he was taking them, and all he was stocking was, funnily enough, chicken stock. I'd rolled my cart over to him, and he barely looked up at me until I spoke. "Is something going on? Why are all the shelves empty?" He'd looked at me, his eyes stern and cold. He couldn't have been more than 15, but the way he'd stared at me had sent a chill right through my bones. "It's almost June," he'd said. "What happens in June?" I'd asked. His eyes had narrowed as if I'd just said something to offend him. He bit the inside of his lip. "You're new around here, right?" he'd asked. I nodded. "Yeah, I am. Why?" "You'd best stock up before June 7th, he'd said. "Why?" "Just do it, lady. Trust me." He didn't give me any answers beyond that, and I wasn't so sure I wanted to ask. The tone of his voice and his posture told me that I'd best not ask too many questions. I'd felt a cloud hanging over me as I returned home afterwards. I'd parked my car in our driveway and gotten out. Looking around, I saw the streets were less active than usual. There were only a few cars out and only a few children playing jump rope across the street. I could hear them singing their little rhyme. I'd heard it before, of course. It seemed to be a popular song for kids in the neighborhood, but I'd never actually put any thought into it. When the sun is high and the springtime wanes, the tapping boy dances upon the blades. Be silent, give tribute, and offer up praise, or he will tear down what you have raised. My attention was pulled away from the little rhyme by the sight of Eric outside his house, bringing things in from his car. It seemed that just like me, he'd picked that day for his grocery shopping, and he'd clearly fared better than I had. "Stocking up?" I'd asked him, and Eric had jumped a little before he looked over at me. He cracked a forced, sheepish smile. "Yeah," he said, "almost June, you know. The earlier you get your start, the better. Things sell out fast." "Yeah, I noticed. The store was sold out of just about everything." "That's why you should shop out of town," Eric had said. "Trust me, it's worth it to go a little bit out of your way." "I suppose. Why is everyone stocking up anyways? What happens in June?" Eric paused. I saw color draining from his skin. For a moment I wondered if I'd given the poor man a heart attack. He looked over at me with an intensity I'd never expected from him. "No one's told you about June 7th yet?" he asked. "No. What happens on June 7th? Eric was quiet for a moment before he gestured to his house with his head. "Why don't you come in for a drink, Summer? Let's talk." I'd never been in Eric's house before. I wasn't sure what I'd expected. There was a fair bit of clutter on the tables I passed and countless old photographs on the walls. Many of them had dirty frames, and the photographs themselves were yellowed with age. I paused in front of one that looked like a wedding photo. There was a much younger Eric standing in a garden with a woman in a bridal gown, although I'd never seen the woman before. I didn't linger for long as I let Eric lead me into the kitchen. He gestured to the table, and I took a seat as he fetched 2 glasses and a pitcher of sweet tea. After he'd poured us both a glass, he sat down across from me. The tea was cool and refreshing. Normally I would have enjoyed it, but alone in Eric's house, I was too on edge. The look on his face was dour and betrayed a great deal of worry. He took a sip from his glass of tea before his eyes met mine again. "Has anyone told you about the tapping boy?" he asked after a few moments. "Tapping boy? Like that nursery rhyme?" Eric scoffed before he gave a half-hearted nod. "Yes, like the nursery rhyme. It's been our way of breaking it down for the children ever since I was a little boy." "What exactly is the tapping boy? An urban legend?" "Of a kind. People here don't like talking about him. It's not wise to speak ill of the tapping boy. He'll know if you do." Eric said. He comes every summer, always on June 7th. And when he comes, he requires tribute. Too little tribute and he'll... Eric paused. He'll request more. It's not advisable to deny his requests either. It's why people buy so much, to ensure he's satisfied with their tribute. People generally stay indoors on the 7th as well. You don't want to meet the tapping boy by accident. I was silent as Eric spoke, partially because I wasn't sure if he was messing with me or describing some strange tradition of the town. So it's like a tradition then? I asked. I saw an unfamiliar rage flash across Eric's face. Tradition? No. I wouldn't use that word, and I'd rather not share with you the kinds of words I would use. As I said, best not to speak ill of the tapping boy. It's unwise to offend him. Please, just buy tribute. Meat, baked goods. Get as much as you can buy and leave it outside your home on the 7th. You and your family will be safe. The way his voice quaked as he said that, Eric was either a very good liar or a very frightened man. Please, Eric said. He'd reached across the table to put his shaking hand over mine. His eyes were wide. He seemed almost on the verge of tears. Please give tribute. The tapping boy is not forgiving, even to newcomers. It was that convinced me that he meant every word of what he'd said. It's a local tradition. It's not a big deal, Scott had said that evening. We'd put Elsie to bed and were watching TV together. Well, Eric seemed pretty worried about it, I'd replied. I don't think I've ever seen him that shaken up before. We've only known him for a month or so, he'd said. He's an old man living alone. He might not be playing with the full deck. We don't know. Besides, we just bought a house. We don't have the kind of money to spend on a whole bunch of food to give to the local boogeyman. What if it's real? I asked. What if there really is something coming on the 7th? There isn't, Scott said. Trust me, I've never heard of any tapping boy before we moved here, and I'm pretty sure Eric was just toying with you. Then why are the shelves empty? Why are people so scared? Scott paused, then shrugged. Well, maybe they're just superstitious. Every community has their quirks. I bit my lip. I felt my own anger boiling over, and I could tell Scott just wanted me to drop it. I had no intention of doing that, though. Can we at least buy something? I said. Just have something to put out just in case. We'll watch and see what happens, then we can decide whether or not to take this seriously. Honey, we'd be buying food we'd never eat. We'd just be wasting money. Scott, please. Please just do this. I'm begging you. I'd taken his hand and held it tight. Scott looked at me, clearly annoyed, but that melted away as he looked into my eyes. All right, he said after a few moments. I'll go to the store tomorrow and pick up some things. I'm not going overboard, though. We'll offer up tribute, but just a small one. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was better than nothing. The next few weeks passed by quietly, but I could still feel the tension in the air in our neighborhood. As May became June, children stopped playing outside. Scott was told he'd be off on the 7th and was advised to stay home. I never got the same notification from my work, but at the same time my work was technically out of state. I'd be at home anyways. We'd bought some fresh beef, pork, and chicken, as well as a few frozen dinners which we'd put in a wicker basket. As the morning of June 7th rolled around, I set our basket out in the front of the house. Looking around, I saw baskets out front of every other house. They were all bigger than ours. Laundry hampers filled with meats and frozen food, left to sit out in the sun. Even Eric had left a large bounty out for the tapping boy. The sight of them made me feel a bit uneasy. I prayed we'd given enough. Scott and Elsie were still in bed when I'd put the basket out, and I'd gone upstairs to my office afterwards. I felt tense, as if I was waiting for some unknown catastrophe to occur. I barely got any work done that morning. I did hear Scott taking care of Elsie when he woke up, and I took a little bit of comfort in the fact that everything sounded normal. So far, June 7th had been just another day, and I let my mind focus on more important matters. I'd been on a call with one of my coworkers when my phone buzzed with a text message, but I didn't think anything of it. I let it sit for a moment. I was sharing my screen, so my work needed my full attention at the moment. As soon as the call ended, I took my phone out of my pocket to check it. As soon as I did, the color drained from my face, and I felt a sinking nausea in my stomach. The message was from Scott. "Going to take Elsie to the park. Be back in a bit. Smiley face." I'd told him not to leave the house. I'd told him so many times not to go out on the 7th. Behind the sudden onset of panic was rage at having been ignored, but I could deal with that later. I hadn't heard Scott and Elsie leave, but they couldn't have been gone long. The park wasn't far away. I could catch up to them and bring them back home before anything bad happened. Scott would be in some very deep shit, but I'd rather spend the rest of my day arguing with him than finding out what consequences there were for going outside. I raced for the door, hesitating before I opened it. Maybe Scott was right. Maybe this was just some silly tradition. Maybe there was no harm in letting him and Elsie go to the park. After all, this whole thing did seem a little bit silly, right? I still knew so little about the tapping boy or what he was supposed to be that I couldn't say for sure what was really going on. That said, the uncertainty still left me feeling sick. Leaving the safety of my husband and my daughter to chance was not something I was comfortable with. I knew I needed to go after them, whatever the risk was, if there even was a risk. I opened the door and I stepped outside. The first thing I saw was the basket I'd left out. There had been no noise from the front of the house when it was ransacked, but the evidence was right there. The wicker had been torn to shreds. The food was missing, leaving only a few tattered cardboard boxes and bits of plastic on my front porch. It looked as if some sort of animal had gotten to it. Had Scott seen this, or had it happened after he'd left? Looking around at the other houses on our street, I saw that their baskets had suffered a similar fate. Plastic laundry hampers were ripped apart to get at what had been inside that morning. There was a strange uniformity to the destruction that did nothing to set me at ease. I took off down the sidewalk, heading towards the park. Whatever was out and about, I didn't want my family to end up in its path. The streets were abandoned as I ran down them. No cars, no pedestrians, and no animals. The only sound I heard were my own footsteps against the sidewalk as I broke into a run. I was only a few blocks away when I first picked up the stench. It was a sickening mixture of the coppery smell of blood and the pungent stink of shit. I caught myself gagging a little as I smelled it, but I couldn't see any obvious source, not until I rounded the next corner. Then I stopped dead in my tracks. The bloody mess in front of me was very likely once a human being, although it wasn't Scott. The messy brown hair and blood-stained blue dress told me that much. The body had been brutally torn apart. Flesh was missing. The face was a pulpy mess of bone and gristle with teeth jutting out. I saw a hand with an engagement ring on it laying on the sidewalk, fingers missing and flesh torn off by what looked to be bite marks. The torso had been twisted almost completely 180 degrees. The stomach had burst open with intestines spilling out onto the pavement. I covered my mouth, both in horror and at the stench. I'd never seen a dead body before, and I found myself wanting to scream at the sight of the one I saw. I felt sick. I wanted to cry. But beyond that, I was afraid. Whatever had killed that girl, it was still out and about. Then I heard it, coming from behind me and getting slowly closer. Whistling. The tune reminded me of "It's Been a Long, Long Time," and the footsteps that heralded the voice were loud and tapped against the pavement rhythmically. There was a carefree nature to the sounds that approached me, as if whoever was whistling and dancing along the sidewalk was having the greatest day of their life. For a moment, I remained frozen to the spot before I slowly turned around. I didn't know what I expected to see: a human, a monster, or something even worse. The man I saw looked human, but the sensation I felt in my chest as I looked into his eyes told me that he was anything but. He was young, anywhere between his mid-teens and early 20s. He wore a neatly pressed suit despite the hot June weather, and he had a playful skip in his step. His movement seemed more like a dance, as if he was Fred Astaire in an old musical. In one hand he held a cane that he tapped against the pavement like a metronome to keep time in his odd performance. He seemed to skip towards me, grinning wide from ear to ear before he stopped. His cane tapped twice against the sidewalk before he bowed as if waiting for applause. I stood there, silent and still shaken from what I'd seen, but the man in front of me hardly seemed bothered. His eyes remained locked on mine and burned with a playful intensity. "Summer Harper," he said, "it's so nice to meet you. I love making new friends in this quiet little town." His voice was high-pitched and mirthful. His smile widened as he said my name, although how he knew it was beyond me. I was silent, unsure how to respond. Every nerve in my body told me to run, but something in the back of my mind told me that I could not outrun him. "I must say I'm both surprised and unsurprised to see you out and about today. I suppose we've had no formal introduction, but I assume you have heard of me." I felt my body shaking and tears filling my eyes. Despite his smile, there was something predatory in the way he looked at me. I kept waiting for him to move, to pounce on me and reduce me to another pile of blood and bone. My fear wasn't lost on the man. The way he was looking at me, it was clear that he was enjoying it. He leaned in closer to me, smile growing wider and wider. His teeth seemed so large and white. "Since you're here, I did want to ask about your tribute. It was a little light. Now, you are new here, and so I'm inclined to let you off easy. I know the folks here don't like to discuss my annual visits, but tribute is necessary. Think of it like taxes. Gotta pay 'em, or else there'll be trouble." His eyes lit up. "Oh, I get it now. You're out here because it was so light. You're here to make sure I get my due, aren't you, Summer?" Slowly, I nodded. Tears were streaming down my cheeks. "Yes," I said softly. Just speaking felt like a defiance. The tapping boy just chuckled. "Well then, since you're new here, I won't ask for too much. How about your left pinky finger?" My heart skipped a beat. What? "Oh, I'm being rude. Here, let me be helpful." From one pocket, the tapping boy produced a small pocket knife that he offered to me. "Now, pinky finger, left hand. How about it, huh?" I could still smell the corpse behind me, and the tapping boy looked past me at it. "Oh, you were admiring my work, weren't you? Poor Diane didn't pay her dues, so I had to take them myself. But it's an honest mistake. You're not going to make the same one, right?" he asked. "No," I said softly as I took the knife. I held up my shaking hand. I looked at my fingers. He said he'd wanted my pinky. That wouldn't be so bad, right? I could cut it off. It would hurt. It would bleed. But I'd be okay. I knew I'd be okay. My blood rushed through my skull. My stomach was swirling. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to scream or beg, but I knew none of that would do me any good. Slowly, I got down onto my knees before the tapping boy. I pressed my left hand against the hot pavement. I looked up at him, watching as he smiled down on me, leaning on his cane for support as he waited for me to do it. I splayed my fingers, and with my right hand, I picked up the knife. My hands were shaking. Every nerve in my body begged me not to do what I was about to do. I looked for reasons to stop myself, but I knew I had no choice. I was in trouble beyond my comprehension, and it was best not to tempt fate. I pressed the knife against my pinky. The pain was white hot. The blade cut through my skin as I pressed down on it. I screamed. I forced my hand to stay still as the knife cut through flesh. Fresh blood spilled out of the wound and onto the sidewalk. I pushed down harder as the knife hit bone. I had to saw and move the blade to get beyond that and slip through the bones. Then I cut through the ligaments and tendons until my finger rolled away in a pool of blood. I was sobbing as I finished. I dropped the knife and looked up at the tapping boy through the tears. "Atta girl," he said softly. "Let's have my knife back now. And the finger, please and thank you." I offered him the finger first, With a shaking hand, I held it up to him and watched as he took it. He held it up to the light, admiring it for a moment before popping it into his mouth. He let out a satisfied, almost sexual moan of pleasure, and his body seemed to wiggle with delight. I gasped for breath in between my sobs and shrank back from the awful figure before me. Then when he looked down again, expecting his knife, I offered that to him next. The tapping boy took it, then patted me on the head with his free hand. "Atta girl, that was good. Maybe I'll be around for the rest next year." He cupped my chin, looking into my eyes and laughing under his breath. "See you around, Summer," he crooned before he pulled away from me and left in the direction he came. I sat on the ground for a few moments, my purpose forgotten as I sobbed and clutched my bleeding hand close to my chest. My blood soaked into my shirt, but I didn't care. I made myself stand. I made myself step over the corpse of the girl, and I made myself continue on my way to the park. I knew the threat now. I knew it was real, and I'd never been so scared in my entire life. I reached the garden on shaking legs with my vision blurred from my tears. I just wanted to find Scott and Elsie. I just wanted to bring them home if they weren't already dead. What I found was far more mundane than I'd expected, but exactly what I'd hoped for. There was a small playground near the center of the park, and I could see Scott and Elsie in the distance. I shambled towards them, screaming for them in a hoarse voice as I drew nearer. "Scott! Elsie!" I saw Scott pause. He'd been pushing Elsie on a swing, and he studied me for a moment before he noticed the state I was in. He took off like a shot, rushing towards me as I fell to my knees in the grass before him. "Jesus Christ, Summer! What the hell happened? You're bleeding, Jesus!" "Get Elsie," I growled. I grabbed Scott by the shirt. "Get her now! Get home now!" Scott only stared at me, confused and unsure what to say. "Go." My voice was weak as I pleaded with him. "Just go, now. I'll be fine. Let's just go home right now. Please, Scott, please." He put a hand on my shoulder, eyes wide, but he didn't say a word of argument. Then he looked up past me and asked, "Who's that?" My blood ran cold as I looked over my shoulder. It had barely been 10 minutes since my mutilation, but he was back again. The tapping boy approached us with that familiar skip in his step, as if there wasn't a thing wrong with the world. His eyes were fixated on Scott this time. "No," I wheezed. "No. No, you got your tribute. No." I stood up, standing between my husband and the tapping boy, who looked at me with that same smile. "Oh, how fun! I had wondered where the rest of the family was. Thank you for showing me the way. I love playing in the park. It's such a thrill," he chimed. He looked at Elsie, still sitting on the swing, then at Scott, who pushed past me to stand defiantly in front of the tapping boy. "Who are you?" he snapped. I put a hand on his shoulder, trying to pull him back, but he shrugged me off. "Scott, don't." He looked at me, then back at the tapping boy. "Did you do this to my wife?" There was venom in his voice I'd never heard before. It didn't faze the tapping boy, though. He just laughed as if the question had been a joke. "Technically, she did it to herself, but it was fun to watch." He cocked his head to the side in the instant before Scott tried to hit him. His fist connected to the side of the man's head, and I saw the tapping boy start to go down, yet he didn't move quite like a human. As he fell, one leg came up and hooked behind Scott's neck. He seemed to spin in midair, and as he did, he pulled Scott down to the ground. One moment my husband was upright, the next he was in the grass with the polished shoe of the tapping boy on his throat. Now, don't be so violent, Scott. You'll get yourself in trouble that way." "Screw you," Scott snarled. The tapping boy's grin only grew ever wider. "Naughty, naughty. That means a higher payment, dear boy." "I'm not paying you shit." "Oh, but you will, one way or another." He looked up at Elsie, and from his pocket, he produced the same knife he'd given me to remove my finger. "Your cute little daughter there. Bring me her right arm, won't you?" Scott's eyes widened in disbelief, and I drew nearer. "Don't," I begged. "Please, no. Please, no. We pay tribute. Don't hurt her. Don't hurt Elsie." You paid some tribute, but more is needed. Those are the rules. The tapping boy chimed. His tone told me that he enjoyed every minute of this. His eyes shifted from myself to Scott. What do you say, Scotty? Will you pay? He offered the knife towards him, and Scott snatched it out of his grasp, only to drive it into the tapping boy's leg. He didn't even flinch. His grin only grew wider. Well, I did ask nicely, he said. His polished shoe pressed harder against Scott's throat. My husband's eyes bulged. He struggled and squirmed beneath the pressure that the tapping boy exuded until I heard the snap of bone. With little effort, the tapping boy pulled his head from his shoulders, and I shrank back in horror as I watched him lift Scott's head to his mouth and take a bite as if he was eating a large apple. Scott's body still twitched and spasmed. The tapping boy chewed thoughtfully and took another bite of my husband's head before he tossed it aside. Then I watched as he picked up his corpse and tore it open with relative ease. Bones and tendons snapped. Organs spilled out onto the grass, yet the tapping boy picked out choice morsels as if he were enjoying a buffet. He popped them into his mouth in a single bite, regardless of their size, and everything he did not want, he threw away. I watched everything, unable to look away, barely noticing the horrified cries of my daughter nearby. I was helpless, just a witness to an atrocity without name. As the tapping boy finished and cast the last of Scott's body away, his eyes fixated on me as he licked the blood from his lips. There's debts to pay, Summer, he crooned. He pulled the knife from his leg and offered it to me again. No, I whispered. Please, not Elsie. Please. Defy me, please. Your flesh was the most succulent I've had in some time. I'll devour your little girl one way or the other, and I'm always quite hungry. Pay or don't, it hardly matters to me. I looked at the knife in his hand. I looked at him, and I knew that if I said no, he would kill me. I took the knife, and on shaking legs, I stood up, and I approached my little girl. Every year, we pay tribute. Elsie has learned to manage with one arm. It wasn't easy, but she is alive. She is as healthy as she can be. I'm thankful for that. My newest child, Scott, is doing well too. I named him after his father. He would have loved to see him. I don't know why the tapping boy comes every year. I don't know what he is, or why he does what he does. I don't suppose I want to know. I know that it doesn't matter if I leave Sycamore Springs. No matter where I am in the world, he will still come for tribute on June 7th. See, in Sycamore Springs, you'll always be a part of the community. And part of being in the community is dealing with the tapping boy. For now, I'll count my blessings that I haven't had any further run-ins with him. My children are as safe as they can be. So am I. Despite its unique tradition, Sycamore Springs is still a good community with good people. But I can't stop having nightmares of a playful grin full of gnashing teeth and the musical tapping of footsteps drawing ever closer, and I don't think I ever will. The Tapping Boy by Head of Spectre.